Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another restful episode of true, scary stories to help you fall asleep. Today, we're going to be reading true creepy encounter horror stories. I hope you enjoy them. So, without further ado, lay back, relax, and enjoy these true, scary stories. So this was about 3.5 years ago, but I still think about it every day. I'll start by saying that I was not being very smart. I was in Miami with a friend, who is now my boyfriend, and we were vacationing / blowing off steam. I was 28, he was 25. We're both gay. I decided to download Grindr and see what was going on. Long story short, I met a guy and went to his place for some fun. We had it. I had a blast. We had some drinks and I was feeling great. It was about 11 p.m. at night and time to wrap up and head back out to the hotel. I saw that it was about a mile walk literally straight down the road, so I head out. Well, I had taken some Adderall and was feeling a little more reckless than I normally am, and decided that maybe I would hook up with someone else. I know, stupid idea. So I log back onto Grindr and instantly connect with such a hot guy. He invites me over, gives me his address, and also says that he could come pick me up. So I'm like standing on the edge of this sidewalk, wondering if I'm going to get picked up or call an Uber to this location, or just go home. And someone pulls up in a truck and says that they're here to pick me up. I'm like, oh wow, you came. That's so nice. I literally remember looking at the picture and at the guy and feeling very confident that they were the same person. So I hopped in the truck. Instantly, I had the weirdest feeling. The truck smelled weird, first of all. I don't know how to describe it. Like the taste of licking iron. I was instantly turned off and felt so weird. He starts driving. Thankfully, I did not close out of the Grindr app when he pulled up, because it was so abrupt. Because I looked down and literally noticed that I'm getting further away from the guy that I was talking to. They were not the same person. I remember that I just started texting and talking, being like, I really like your blonde hair. Your gray truck is really cool. Is this a 2014 Chevy Silverado? I just told my friends about you and have to be home by 12 p.m. just for your information. We can go to my hotel. They'd love to meet you. Trying to make it seem like I have people waiting on me, that I disclosed part of his identity. Anything. This lasted about 2 to 3 minutes until he pulled over and said that he wasn't feeling like hanging out. To this day, I think I was picked up by someone who saw an easy target, but thankfully, I was slightly resourceful in the moment. I was in New Orleans for a work conference. I was early for a dinner, so I was seated at a little table next to the piano for a cocktail before my party came. This man was at the adjacent table, and we started talking. Very benign, seemed fine. The waitress came up to him and sternly said, I know you want to keep talking to this young lady, but if I don't seat you now, you'll lose your table. He left and was seated. The waitress came back to me and told me that the man paid for my drink. That's fine, I said, tell him thank you. Minutes later, a waiter came over and told me that he'd like for me to join him since he's dining alone. I told him to tell him thank you, but I'm waiting for my party. I'm seated with my group, and his table is right next to ours and he is staring the entire time while he's eating. It was unnerving, but like, okay, maybe he thought I was an escort. I don't know. The rest of my party noticed too. And well after he was done eating, he stayed at the table and continued to watch me. Fast forward to the next night. I go meet some friends at a hotel bar to listen to live music. Mind you, this is in a completely separate part of town. New Orleans is huge. I go to the bar to grab a drink, and this man is at the bar, again staring at me with almost a disdain. I've had maybe 3 other occurrences in my life where I felt this deep, unsettling feeling. Was he following me? What are the odds that we would be in the same place? I had a terrible dream last night that I was stuck in an elevator with this man, but I didn't know it was him, and he found out where I lived and tried to break in. It felt like a psychic attack, a deep, unnerving, violating feeling. I've dealt with plenty of creeps, but this one was different. This just happened, and I still don't feel safe, even locked inside of my home. I was outside with my puppy for about an hour. She kept getting distracted by a bunny, so I walked around the apartment complex a few times, trying to get her to use the bathroom. As I'm waiting for her to hopefully use it, because it's past midnight, one of the neighbors starts walking up to me. She's barking at him, and he doesn't stop trying to approach. I yell out that he shouldn't come up to me in the middle of the night, and he only responds with a "hey there" and comes closer. I tell him to leave me alone, and he asks if my dog will bite, which I lie and say yes, and to leave. Even when I quickly walked away, taking the longer way to loop around to my apartment because I need to put as much distance from him and I, he stood where I was moments ago watching me. I looked back every few seconds, and he was still watching me. This isn't the first weird encounter with him. He's tried to approach me before while I was with my sister, and then my father. But this is the first time I was alone in the middle of the night. My dad's friend and his wife were passing through town, so they stopped by our house to visit. Let's call my dad's friend A. I've always been uncomfortable around him, but it's just getting to the point where I can't stand to be around him. He forced me into multiple hugs during his visit, and they always lasted way too long. He'd also run his hands down my body when he pulled away, and kiss me on the cheek when it was extremely obvious that I was uncomfortable. He sat right beside me on the otherwise empty couch, to the point where I was quite literally squeezed between him and the arm of the couch, and he put his hand on my knee and was rubbing it. He kept making comments about how pretty I was, which aren't inherently creepy, but coupled with his other actions, were just weird. I honestly want to tell my dad how comfortable A makes me, but I'm afraid that he won't take it well, or will tell me that I'm overreacting. I personally don't think that I am overreacting, but I just want to get an outside perspective. I'm sure I'll sound crazy, but I'm super creeped out from a recent interaction at a grocery store. I was shopping with my toddler and an older lady, maybe 70-ish, who was by herself, just came up and said, "Ma'am, just so you know, all canned veggies are in sale for 50 cents this week," and went on about how it's a great deal and they don't run it often. I said thanks, I appreciate the heads up, and I'll definitely grab a few on my way out. Then she begins to walk away and is almost out of sight when she stopped and looked back and smiled at my son. She then asked how old he was. I said, "Oh, just over a year." She then asked if he was my only child and some other random questions about him. She then goes, "Hey, I just remembered I have some clothes in my trunk, all boys stuff in the 2T to 3T range," and asked if I wanted it. I politely declined. I said we'll be shopping a while, and I didn't want to hold her up. She then proceeds to say, "Oh, it's not a problem. I'll just wait outside and then I can come back in and find you before you leave. Are you a single mom? Would you need them?" I got this gut feeling that something was off about this lady, and I just said nope. Not a single mom, and we have all the clothes that we need, and then thanked her for the offer. She tried a few more times, saying things like, "I just don't know what to do with them. If you could use them, I'd be happy to give them all to you." At this point, it really felt like she was trying to lure me and my son to her car. I continued to decline the offer and then walked away. I did a few more laps around the store, looking for things that I needed, and at one point I saw her standing in an aisle in the center of the store with a younger man just people watching. I could just be super paranoid, and she was just a sweet old lady trying to be nice. But something in my gut just told me to get out of the conversation as quickly as possible. I feel like parents will know that having a small child with you makes strangers talk to you all the time and make small talk about your sweet kiddos. But this conversation did not feel the same as others that I've had while out and about with my son. Has anyone else ever had a similar experience? I feel lucky that all of these encounters occurred in public places. For reference, I'm a 24-year-old female, have freckles and naturally red hair, and I'm about 5'7". The first time this man, who appeared to be about my same age and height, approached me while I was in a popular downtown bar with my best friend. I saw this man approach, and I was not interested, so as to not lead him on, I kept my responses short. The conversation went as follows. His intro line was, "You have so many freckles. They're in such random places." Me, "That is how freckles work." Him, "That's how you know you're a real redhead." I was creeped out already at this point. Me, "I'm well aware." He lingered to ask a couple of more pointless questions until my friend and I managed to get away. My friend and I ended up going to a different bar across the street a little later in the night. We had settled into the new bar, were a little drunker, and my friend went to the bathroom, leaving me at a high-top table up against the wall. The same man appeared out of nowhere to my left and put one arm against my table and the other against the wall, so I had nowhere to go, saying to me, "You're the redhead from before." Fellas, never physically trap a girl that you're trying to hit on. I was extremely uncomfortable, but I figured my friend would be back soon and would be able to help me out of the situation without causing a scene. He asked me several awkward questions. Meanwhile, I had secretly texted my friend to hurry back to save me from a creepy guy. He then asks, "Take a picture with me." Me, why? Him, "For the memories." I was still trapped, and I was hoping that if I complied, he would leave me alone. So I let him take a picture of us while I was smiling a fake hostage smile. My friend had reappeared, but was standing by the bar and not approaching the table. I pretended to be drunker than I was and rushed over to her gushing, "Oh my God, you're back, let's go dance." And I dragged her away to explain the situation. Fast forward a week. My next encounter with this man was at a completely different and very busy bar with different female friends of mine. I was having a good time, and suddenly I looked to my left, and this man, I kid you not, was running in my direction, phone outstretched, with the picture that he forced me to take with him on the screen. I had had enough, and I was done being polite to save his feelings as I sat there scared. I told him, "Leave me alone, you creep me out." He venomously replies, "Well, you're an ugly jerk anyways." My friends catch wind something is going on, and as he walks away, they offer to protect me if needed. For months, I thought that it was my last interaction with this man. I was wrong. I had taken it as a warning, an example of how men's demeanor can change once they have been rejected, and it was chilling. 7 months later, I had forgotten about the prior encounters, and I was casually browsing a drugstore makeup display at night after the gym. I was looking down at a product when my spidey senses started going off. Someone was standing on the other side of the display and staring at me in my periphery. I look up, and a man was 2 feet in front of me. I did not yet realize it, but it was the same man. He asked me if the drugstore we were in sold chapstick. It's a drugstore. Everyone, without fail, sells chapstick. Taken aback, my initial thought was that he assumed I was an employee, and I replied, "I don't work here." He smiled a slow smile, maintained eye contact, and said okay. We both continued shopping until he returned to another makeup aisle I was at in the store. He said, "I think I've met you before." I told him I didn't believe we had, as I truly didn't remember him yet. He began to ask me questions that every girl my age in my city would answer yes to. "Have you been downtown before?" Me. "Well, yeah, everyone has. But like every weekend." Me. "Not every single weekend." Him. "No, but last summer with girls." At this point, I was getting a very bad feeling in my stomach. Everything about his body language, demeanor, and the things that he was saying felt off. And he was staring. He insisted 2 more times that we had met and would not let it go. So I suggested, "Lots of people confuse me with other redheads they've met before. I'm sorry, I don't remember meeting you." He stared at me, and after a moment slowly said, "No, I know the redhead I spoke to." I began walking to the register and he followed. As I walked, it finally clicked who it was, and I was afraid. His social unawareness and weird questions made me sure that it was him. I played it cool until I had paid for my items and I was leaving the store. I didn't look back, but I knew he had items to pay for before he could follow. So as soon as I was out the door, I sprinted for my car. I got in, locked it, and sat for a moment stunned as I processed what had happened. I came to my senses quickly, and I drove to the parking lot exit. I looked back, and he was just outside the doors of the pharmacy, his head looking back and forth across the dark parking lot for me. I know that he saw my car leaving the parking lot, and since it was at night, few people were at the pharmacy, so it was clearly me leaving. I took note of the car that he was walking to, and I decided to take an extra long route home just to ensure that I wasn't being followed. This route led through a wealthy neighborhood at the far east end of my city, so there is nothing that way aside from high-end homes. I looped through a roundabout in this neighborhood, and I saw a car matching his drive straight through. There was no way to know if it was his. However, it was chilling. There was no sign of his car after that. A couple weekends later was my final encounter. It was St. Patrick's Day, and the bars downtown were as packed as I've ever seen them. I was in the same bar he had first approached me in months before, alone, as I was waiting for friends to get through security. He rushed up to me from the crowd. He said, "Hey, I know you from the name of the pharmacy." I had to assertively tell him to leave me alone multiple times. He kept asking, "Why? Do you have a boyfriend?" I responded again saying, "That's none of your business. Leave me alone." It is interesting how some men only seem to take another man's claim to a woman as a no, and not a woman's obvious and direct disinterest. To this day, another 7 months later, that was the last that I saw of him. I am lucky that these encounters were in public. They could have easily turned out violent otherwise. I wrote this hoping to show other women that being assertive and at times rude is completely okay and necessary to protect yourself. Some men do not take no for an answer easily. To this day, it baffles me why he would try so hard to make me remember him after he called me an ugly jerk. Anyways, stay vigilant, ladies. This happened when my best friend was 17 and a half, and I was 17 in 1996. My best friend, Chrissy, and I are both smaller females. She is 5'4", and at the time weighed 110 pounds, but was a soccer player, very athletic and strong. I'm 5'7", and at the time I weighed 125 pounds. We are both blue-eyed blondes, and were often asked if we were sisters or cousins. This is a large reservoir on the outskirts of her town, surrounded by a beautiful public park. We figured we'd be fine to walk around in the park because lots of people go hiking there. I had gotten some really good quality weed, and we were looking forward to finding a peaceful place to smoke some out in nature. I had my pipe ready in my pocket, and we were stoked. We chose to go out on a Saturday. It was a beautiful sunny day, and there were not many people there. We parked her car by the reservoir, in the mostly vacant lot that had 2 other cars. We did not see anybody when we got there. We walked around the water for a bit, and then chose a trail to go up. It was about 80 degrees out, and we were sweating, but we had some water in my small day pack. As we got about a quarter mile or so into the trail, I started having a weird feeling. I looked at her quietly and asked, "Hey, do you feel something is off here? Everything is really quiet." Where there were usually crickets chirping and frogs singing, it was totally silent. She looked at me and said, "Yeah, I think so." And then we heard some crackling of leaves about 60 feet behind us and a bit to the left. We did not see anybody at that time, so we continued forward. We were both getting pretty nervous, and we heard the crackling again, this time a little bit closer. We still did not see anyone. Each time we would continue forward, we would hear footsteps a little bit more behind us. I thought we were being stalked. There was a turn off to the left, which led to a clearing by a large rock about 12 feet high, with a large, sturdy rope anchored on it to climb up to the top. It was part of a steep hillside of the cliff. The rope to climb it was anchored to the ground as well, so no one could move it. I told her, "We need to get up to that rock now. We need high ground." She nodded and went up first with me right behind her. We flew up that rock, clinging to the rope tightly and going as fast as we could. When we reached the top, we turned around to see an older man, probably about 45, with a slighter build, wearing a jacket, jeans, and glasses coming into the clearing. He was about 20 feet away. He looked at us with a cold, vacant expression. I got goosebumps looking at him. I shouted, "Hi, will you please leave us alone? We're trying to have some privacy here." He gave no response, and with a blank expression, slowly started walking towards the rope which led to the top of the rock. My friend at this point was really scared and asked, "What do we do?" I saw a large rock about 8 inches and almost square to my right, so I grabbed it. I was surprised at how heavy it was, but my adrenaline was going, so I lifted it easily. I told her, "Look around for the biggest rocks you can find, fast. Move them next to us. Hold the biggest one. If that guy tries to come up, we throw them at him and hit him as hard as we can. Aim for his head." Fortunately, there was a pile of sizable rocks behind us to the left, like someone had made a ring to hold a fire on top of the rock and then moved them away. She brought a few over and held a large one herself. My friend and I stood close to the edge of the rock, holding our makeshift weapons. I looked down to the base of the rock where this guy was considering the rope. He looked up at us again with very cold blue eyes and no expression. Then he reached his hand for the rope. I shouted loudly, "Do not come up here. If you try to come up here, you're gonna get really hurt. We are aiming for your head with these rocks. Get the heck away from us." I held the rock close to my chest so he could see it. My friend was next to me doing the same thing, and we had a whole pile of more rocks. He blinked his eyes and cocked his head a little bit, then released his hand from the rope and silently backed away. He backed to the edge of the clearing, backed through the brush, still watching us, and then we heard his crunching footsteps go back through the woods until we couldn't hear him anymore. We stayed on the rock for another 20 minutes, maybe more, watching and waiting. There was no other way to access the rock except for the steep hillside covered with poison oak, so we did not think that he'd try it, and plus, we'd be able to hear him if he did. After we didn't hear anything for 20 minutes, we decided to make a break for her car. We threw several rocks down to the ground. Mine hit the dirt with a particularly satisfying thud. Chrissy went first down, while I was keeping watch in case he came back. When I was scaling down the rock, she was holding a rock ready to throw it full force if he returned. Fortunately, he did not. We each grabbed the largest rock we could carry. put a few smaller ones in our pockets for good measure, then headed back to her car on the trail, very carefully and very quietly. The crickets were chirping again, so we felt that he had left, but we were still extremely cautious. We did make it back to her car without incident and quickly left. That was the last time that I've ever hiked in that park. A while back, my husband and I wanted to check out a park that we had never been to before. It's on the outskirts of a smaller town, just a small forested park with a few walking trails, and a parking lot for about 20 cars or so. We got out of the car and walked over to the information board, while a man in the other occupied car in the lot started shouting random nonsense at us. There were only 4 total cars in the lot, so there were not a lot of other people around. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was super creepy. He kept shouting religious questions and random nonsense, so we didn't feel safe going on the trails into the woods. Instead, we got back into the car and drove to another park on the opposite side of town, at least 10 miles away, and not a straightforward route between the two places. We go and have a nice hike, come back to the car about 30 minutes later, and guess who slowly drives past us? Yep, creepy guy from the first park. We could not imagine that he just happened to follow the same route and end up at this same park by random coincidence. But the thing is, I watched to make sure that he didn't follow us. He did not follow us out of the first park, and at no point was he behind us while driving. How did he find us? For context, this happened to me years ago when I was about 13, maybe 14. I grew up in a small to mid-sized city in the West, pretty safe in a quiet middle-class neighborhood. This was back when I still bought into organized religion, and I was going to an overnight lock-in at the church gym. For the non-Christian kids who aren't familiar, it's basically a huge Christian-focused sleepover for teens. The church was only maybe a 10 to 20 minute walk from my house, and the quickest way to get there was to cut across a park right next to the elementary school. This was the early 2000s, so I definitely grew up in the age of stranger danger and teaching girls to always be vigilant. On the other hand, I was walking a short distance through my own neighborhood to the church, and I was very responsible for my age. I was an oldest daughter, always the babysitter, and my parents had okayed me walking by myself and would drop by with my sleeping bag and pillow after they picked up my little brother from practice. I was running a little late, so the sun was just setting as I approached the park. As I crunched my way across the grass next to the tennis court, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Turning my head, I saw a figure, clearly a man, dressed in dark clothing and leaning against the brick wall of the school. He was kind of tucked into an alcove, formed where the building met the fence around the playground, out of the sight from the road. The man was standing just outside the halo of light from the lamp above a nearby door. The man was just lounging in the crux of the wall and the fence. What initially caught my eye was the flicker of the lit cigarette in his mouth. It was too dark to see his features, but I could tell as I noticed him that he was already watching me. He was a fair distance away across the grass, but it was just open space between us. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on me. I felt that uneasy tingle creep down my spine. I suddenly realized that I was alone in the growing dark, and here was some unknown man tracking me with his eyes that I couldn't make out. Instead of continuing to cut diagonally across the park, I veered right towards the sidewalk and the street, so that I wouldn't come too close to him. I walked a little faster, trying to shake off my uneasiness, telling myself, "You're just being silly." The first time I glanced back, he hadn't moved, though I could still feel him watching. As I left the grass of the park and approached the street corner, I felt briefly relieved. I was back under the street lamps, which by now had flickered on. Only 3 or 4 short blocks until I was at the church. I glanced back once more to reassure myself that I had worried for no reason, expecting to see nothing. By now, the man should be completely out of view. Instead, I felt the pit of dread in my stomach turn to acidic fear when I realized that the man was in fact halfway across the park now, walking in my direction. I immediately crossed to the other side of the street and began walking faster. At this point, I could feel the adrenaline rushing through me. I didn't have any real words or images to describe what I thought would happen to me, just a jumble of snippets from news reports and vague fears about what happens to young girls out alone at night. I was still trying to convince myself that it could just be a coincidence. The man could just be walking in the same direction. After another block, as I approached the next corner, I looked back again. The man had reached the edge of the park, and instead of walking straight ahead, he too had crossed the street to my side. Even worse, it seemed like he had closed some of the distance between us. And, to my eyes at least, it seemed like he was walking faster. I immediately felt my terror increase. At this point, I was convinced that he was a predator, and I had made myself easy prey. I still had 2.5 blocks to the church, but at this point, I was wondering whether I would ever make it to the lock-in. I glanced back at the man once more, and he had closed the gap even further with his longer legs. I still couldn't clearly see his face, but I had seen enough. I turned around and started all out running up the street. My backpack thumped against my back. My heart raced. My breath turned shallow. I ran all the way to the church parking lot before I looked back again, and by the time I did, the man was gone. To this day, I have no idea if that man was after me, or if he just thought that I was some weird kid running down the street at dusk. Frankly, I'm glad to have never found out, one way or the other. I'm a 25-year-old male, and at this time of the story, I was probably 21, and I was taking an afternoon walk down the nature trail just outside the subdivision where I lived. Note that this trail was right next to a moderately busy 2-lane road with some houses on the opposite side of the road, so the area wasn't desolate. However, there was a line of trees and foliage that stood between the trail and the road, obscuring the view from one side of the other. So, passing cars, not having a clear view of what transpired on the trail. At some point I spotted a woman, late 20s I'd guess, standing alone in the middle of the trail. She stood there and watched me as I made my way down the trail towards her. Once I got close, she asked me if I could borrow my cell phone to call someone. Now, I had already read enough scary stories on subreddits like Let's Not Meet to know about tactics like this. I'd heard the stories about how a woman would ask for aid, get people in a vulnerable position, and then a man would swoop in and take the mark by surprise. I hesitated, but I still gave in to the social pressure and desire to help another person in need. I gave her my phone despite my better judgment. I was, however, on edge. I tensed up and began looking around the place to see if anyone would pop out from somewhere, ready to react should someone show up. I also made a point to remain standing in arm's reach of the woman. Then, I hear rustling from the brush. I instantaneously turned towards the sound and watched as a man, who looked around the same age as the woman, was notably quite short, probably around 5'5", emerges from the foliage. I was probably glaring at him with the very obvious suspicion as he made his way over to the woman, standing at her side without saying a word. The woman handed me my phone back, saying they didn't pick up, not even reacting to the man's presence. I took my phone and left. What I assume happened is that they were planning on mugging me, but ended up bailing for whatever reason. Maybe it's because I was visibly on edge, and they figured that it wasn't worth trying to get the drop on me. Maybe the guy figured that there was too much of a size distance between us. Or maybe he'd already put his plan into action, made a little too much noise, and bailed while keeping a completely cool face. as he made his way over to his presumed significant other. For my part, I was ready to grab the woman and use her as a human shield, maybe push her on him. Glad it didn't come to that, especially given the outside possibility that there's some non-mugging explanation for this. I'm a mid-20s female, and I went to the local grocery store tonight around 5 p.m. It's winter and getting dark by 5 p.m. where I live. I was in an aisle taking my time deciding between the options, when this late 20s, early 30s looking guy with light features, glasses, and a scruffy beard comes up right next to me and just stands there. I didn't think much of it, or even look at him at first, because I figured whatever, he's just looking too. But then, after a few seconds, I noticed he wasn't moving or doing anything, just standing there. So I looked at him, and he was already staring at me, and for half a second I thought that he might say something to me. So I stood there for a second just looking back at him. He didn't say anything, so I just turned and fast walked away. At this point, I'm thinking, okay, that was weird, but whatever. Probably just an awkward guy who doesn't know how to talk to women. Then, not 30 seconds later, I'm in another aisle, and I see him out of the corner of my eye coming down the aisle I'm in. Again, staring right at me. So again, I walked away as fast as I could, and went right to the self-checkout. While I was out self-checkout, I'm looking over my shoulders the whole time, making sure that he isn't behind me anymore, and he's not. I start walking out of the store, relieved that once again I was just being paranoid, and I wasn't ever in any real danger. As I'm walking out, I decide to look behind me one more time, and there he is, right behind me. I then notice that he has nothing in his hands, no groceries, and he's heading towards the door right on my heels. Without even looking, I just stop dead in my tracks. I look right at him again. He's already looking at me. And then he puts his head down looking at his phone and walks past me out the door. He bought nothing. I'm so scared at this point that my head is spinning. I didn't know what to do. I can see my car because I parked close to the exit. Thank goodness. So I call my fiance and sprint as fast as I can to my car. I jump in, lock the doors, and start looking for this guy. Then I see him. He's aimlessly walking around the parking lot through the cars. He's pretty far away from me at this point, and I have my fiance on the phone, so I'm feeling somewhat safe again. I watched him walk around for another few seconds before I got out of there. I have no idea what this guy was doing or what his motive could have been. Maybe he was just a weird dude who didn't know how to talk to girls, or maybe he was a predator with dangerous intentions, or maybe he thought that I looked like easy prey for a robbery. The thing I really can't wrap my head around is the fact that each time I noticed him, he was already staring at me. He was not discreet at all, and I would think a dangerous predator might be a little more inconspicuous. He also didn't buy anything from the grocery store, which I also can't understand. I was in the store about 5 minutes before I noticed him, so I'm sure that he didn't follow me in the store. Am I being paranoid? There's a lot that didn't feel right, so I'm having a really hard time trying to rationalize this experience. Definitely a creepy encounter. My roommate and I woke up to a man watching us sleep. For context, I'm a sophomore in college, in a house full of 4 girls including myself. We live in the student housing sector and went all out for Halloween decorations, girly ones at that. We live facing towards the main street of the neighborhood, and our backyard has a bunch of trees and bushes. There's a trail to the back door, but it's in a weird place and is away from the main sidewalk. In terms of our actual house, there's a rather large window on our back door, and we didn't have any window coverings, so it was very clear as day to see into our whole bottom floor when we were looking through it. I know we should have covered it up sooner, but I didn't think it was an urgent matter. One night, my roommate and I were watching a movie, and we both fell asleep on the couch. I never sleep on that couch, and neither does she. It's very uncomfortable. In fact, we both woke up at separate times this night, and just decided to stay on the couch rather than walking the 10 steps to our room. Looking back, I feel that was just a little intuition that we had, or even a guardian angel. We also had fallen asleep almost every night with every light imaginable on, so anyone peering through that window could see us on the couch clearly, and all of our girly decor. It was about 5 in the morning, and I get woken up by my roommate shaking me, saying, "B, get up. B, get up. There's someone trying to get in." I instantly shoot up, see her terrified look looking at the back of the door, then instantly turn my head. I'm literally getting chills writing this. I see a man standing with a hoodie on, holding a flashlight trying to pick our lock. I can still remember the scratching noise he made with whatever he was using. It definitely wasn't the sound of keys jingling. More of a thin wire against metal sound. As we were both staring at him, at this point frozen in fear, he stopped. All three of us were just looking at each other for about a minute, when he slowly backed away from the door. My first instinct was to run to the door and make sure that it was locked. I have never been so scared walking up to a door, and I never want to feel like that again. We quickly called the police and some friends in the area. The police came about 45 minutes later and just told us to call if anything else happens. They said it could be a drunk college student or a person with bad intentions, but we will never know. I still get a sick feeling thinking about it, and I hope that it was a drunk mistake, but something tells me that it was not. We quickly installed more cameras, door/window stoppers, and covers for every part of the house. 3 weeks later, we had a break-in, but that's a story for another time. I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts about this. My 20-year-old daughter and her 19-year-old friend went to Walmart at about 10 p.m. on a weekend night. As they were getting out of my daughter's van, they noticed a guy in the parking lot walking in and paying attention to them. My daughter is average height and average weight, like 5'6" and 140 pounds, while her friend is 4'8" and extremely petite at about 85 pounds. They both got weirded out and came back home to get me or my older daughter to go back to Walmart with them, as what was needed was essential. My other daughter and I were out in another building on my property with my dog, and she was on the doggy treadmill, and it makes a lot of noise. We didn't hear them, so they left and went back to Walmart without either of us. They go back to Walmart, and they don't see the guy, so they decided to run in and get what was needed and get out. They walked in and were heading back to get what they needed, and out of nowhere this creeper spies them and heads straight to them. It startled both of them. The creeper walked up into my daughter's personal space and was wearing mirrored sunglasses and asked the girls how these glasses looked on him. My daughter was so taken aback and startled that she shoved the guy away from them both and loudly exclaimed to him, "I don't know you. Get away from us now." The creeper was completely derailed and unhinged by her yelling at him. He came in the second time, and she told him that she was going to call 911. This happened several years ago. I had just finished going back and forth down the nature trail, just outside my subdivision a few times. As was custom for my attempts to exercise and lose weight, I turned into the entrance to my subdivision and began walking up the street that inclined upwards, where I would eventually turn right and enter the street on which I lived. I had earbuds in and wasn't paying a great deal of attention to my surroundings, But a little ways ahead of me was a big black truck, sitting on the left side of the street, and standing on the curb beside it were a couple of little boys, probably around 4 to 6 years old. I was walking up in the street behind it, about to move over to the right side of the street to pass the truck and turn onto my street. Well, once I got close, the truck immediately peeled out of there, tires screeching, veering hard right and disappearing down my street. I stop and watch the truck vanish from sight, then look over at the kids confusedly, briefly contemplate approaching them and asking them about what just happened, but I shrug it off and continued on towards home. As I continue home, I think back to the situation and start playing back what I'd seen in my mind, piecing together what I'd just witnessed. There was someone in that truck talking to them, and although I hadn't heard what he said on account of me listening to music and not paying attention, I could hear that it was a man's voice. It also occurred to me that the man had his door wide open while talking to the kids, and had not so much as bothered closing it before peeling out. I also noticed that the kids were staring up at him silently, perhaps not with clear fear on their faces, but they didn't look like they liked the situation that they were in. And of course, this reiterates what I had briefly considered asking those kids about. Was this guy a complete stranger trying to coax them into their truck? I dismissed the thought, deciding that it was incredibly unlikely and that there must have been some other explanation. Part of me even wanted it to be true, so that I could have a neat story to tell and claim to have stopped a child abduction. But being aware of that desire, I figured I would just let my imagination run wild. And so I put it out of my mind for a little while, maybe a week or two. Eventually, I thought back to that day, and by that point the denial had worn off. I could no longer deny that I had witnessed what was obviously an attempted child abduction. I thought about calling the cops, or going around and knocking on doors in the area until I found the kids' parents. Or even asking the kids themselves about it when I'd see them playing on the street later. But I'd figured that the time to act had long passed. The kids weren't abducted, and they probably told their parents about it already. And that, seeing as how I didn't have any real identifying information for the police beyond man in black truck, they'd just think that I was wasting their time anyways. Looking back on it now, I'm ashamed of my complete inaction here. What I should have done was ask the kids about the guy in the truck, called the cops if/when they confirmed my suspicions, and taken them to their parents and explained what happened to them myself. And even if it was embarrassing to come around a week or so after the fact and have to explain why I didn't say or do anything at the time, I 100% should have found the parents and told them what I witnessed. I went and deluded myself into thinking that I hadn't seen what I had clearly just seen. For all I know, taking action could have stopped this guy and saved some other kids from the same fate. I was the creep in this story. Something like 10 years ago, I got my first ever dog, a toy-sized poodle puppy. She was way cute and also too smart for her own good. She quickly learned that little kids, elderly ladies, and people who wore pink and sparkling stuff loved puppies. So much that she could get people food from them. Well, one day she escapes the yard while I'm vacuuming the house, and I ended up going all over searching. I started on foot, and then decided that she must have gone far. Maybe got out right whenever I started. And so I got in my car and started driving all over the neighborhood, calling her and showing people walking by pictures of her and asking if they'd seen a puppy. As I'm driving around hollering for her, I see some kids on their lawn playing with Barbies. They look 5 to 6 years old maybe, and they hear me calling for my pup and come running up to ask me what kind of puppy I lost. I was going to show them my phone picture, and I realized that this is the exact scenario that they use to teach stranger danger. So instead, I was like, go get your parents. I need to talk to them. One girl did, but the other stood there, even put her hands on the windowsill of my car, and asked me if I had a puppy in the car. At the time, my only thought was for the parents to hurry up, because I really didn't know what to do. So the mom comes running out and has a total panic over her child being up at a stranger's car, and comes running over. I explained to her that I lost my dog and gave her my number and show her the picture, etc. But I doubt that she believed any of it, because she just scooped up her kids and carried them into the house. When I was about 8, my brother and I would spend some summer weeks at my grandparents' house on their campsite. A little bit of background: this was in the Netherlands, so not very remote, yet on the edge of a forest. My grandpa had gifted me an odometer for my bicycle, so I'd be cycling around the campgrounds a lot, and sometimes around it. The camping had an access road, a dead-end parallel road that led into the forest, and a forest path leading to the rear pedestrian entrance of the campsite. One day, my brother, 11 years old at the time, told me that whenever I would be spoken to, asked something, or followed by someone out the campsite, I should just gun it and cycle my lungs out. I thought nothing of it. Days later, I was doing another run around the campsite, and a car was parked in the ditch on the crossing of the access road and parallel road. As soon as I turned onto the parallel road, the car started driving and following me. I remembered what my brother said and started cycling as fast as I could. I stayed in the middle of the street so that he couldn't overtake me without ramming me or having to go into the ditch. He must have come within 5 feet or so, but I managed to get to the end of the street where the road ended, with wooden poles as a barrier, and kept barreling towards the rear entrance. I never went outside the campground's roads again. I felt I dodged a major bullet. I never told anyone what happened, but I can't help but wonder what triggered my brother to tell me to just make a run for it. Thank you so much for listening to all of the stories in this video. I hope you enjoyed them. I also hope that you enjoy the extra rain at the end. Get a great night's sleep, everyone, and I'll read to you in the next video. Good night, everybody.